Hello, everybody. A warm welcome to Wisdom from North, the place where we're diving into the deeper meaning of life and asking the big questions. My name is Jannike, and today I'm here with wonderful Teal Swan again, and we will be speaking about her new book, The Completion Process, the practice of getting yourself back together again. And I will also ask Teal some questions that I am curious about. Now, for those of you who don't know Teal, she is one of the leading spiritual teachers in the world. She's the author of The Sculpture in the Sky and Shadows Before Dawn, which I have here in Norwegian actually. And
Ooh,
yeah, and she has a great YouTube channel where she answers questions from viewers every week. And she's doing synchronization workshops all around the world where she brings people up on stage and helps them with their issues through her extrasensory abilities that she has been born with. Now, I recommend to check out our previous interviews where we spoke about the law of attraction and soulmate relationships. But first, hello, Teal. How are you? Welcome back on my show.
that was a good introduction. I feel like a very busy person now.
Well, I mean, you are. To be honest, I'm incredibly impressed about how much you're doing because I feel like you just came out with this book and then now you're coming out with a new book and you're doing synchronization workshops and you just got married as well. So, congratulations. And you're giving out videos every week. So, I mean, it's really amazing. You must have a lot of energy.
Yeah, must be.
So let's dive into your new book.
All right.
Because from what I understand, this was about self-love, you accepting yourself and really learning how to love yourself. And that the new book is more about diving into the shadows in ourselves. So tell us about like your intention with the book and what you wanted to do to people, how it can help people.
So I've been using a process myself, facilitating other people for a lot of years now. It's a process that I created over the years, trying to recover from all the abuse that I went through in my own childhood. So with my extrasensory abilities, I'm able to do a lot of soul retrieval. On top of that, I have a very vast understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what I've done is basically created a process which masters pretty much every modality that people have had over the last 2,000 years for overcoming issues that you may face. Now, it's easy to think that trauma is like limited to people who've been to war or things like that, but trauma is a very wide spectrum. I say it's a spectrum because on this side you've got the trauma of, say, being weaned. Pretty much everybody was weaned in a way that wasn't really beneficial to them in this day and age, and that's a trauma. It's something that emotionally we struggle with and can't really move beyond, so it creates a bit of a catch where a portion of us is still stuck there. For example, a lot of abundance issues that people have in their adult life links back to trauma around nursing. So on this spectrum, we've got that, and on this other side of the spectrum, you've got people like me who went through years upon years of trauma and who suffer from complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Or you've got return vets from war, or civilians who were in war-torn areas, things like that. Or people who were in car wrecks and lost relatives in it. Basically, when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about anything that we can't really get past. So going through that experience has made it so that our future life trajectory went a certain way. So if I experience trauma in a relationship, I'm having trouble in my future relationships. Anytime there is that A causes B type of situation, we need to go back and revisit the trauma in a way that we can find resolution. So I've been using this process for years with people, facilitating it myself. And somebody suggested to me once that I just turn it into a process that other people can use. And I had a real existential crisis. Because basically, well, it's a long story, but with trauma, the reason that people don't resolve trauma a lot of times is because it's so difficult for us to deal with it emotionally that we dissociate in the moment of trauma. And it's that dissociative process that in fact causes post-traumatic stress disorder, and to a lesser degree causes people to see those negative effects in the future, right?
What do you mean by dissociate?
To dissociate is to basically experience a disreality where, like, in the moment, it's what people experience sometimes when they're doing a full-on out-of-body experience, where let's say that they get in a high-speed car crash and suddenly their perspective is that they're watching their own body tumble through the air. So that would be the farthest degree of dissociation in any experience. But dissociation is like shades of gray. So like a girl who's being sexually abused when she's younger oftentimes will remove herself mentally from the experience. And so even though she feels vague sensations, the emotional experience isn't there. And maybe when she's going through it, it was so traumatic that she escaped into a fantasy of, say, hiding inside of a snow globe that was on the desk next to the bed. So there's all these shades of gray of dissociation, but dissociation occurs when we feel inequipped to experience fully with our full consciousness the totality of an experience. And it's a good thing in the moment because it enables you to not completely go straight to hell, let's say when you go through a traumatic experience. However, it creates a split in consciousness. So if you think of your consciousness as a stream, at the moment of trauma, you can imagine another stream breaking off of the mainstream and going sideways. And oftentimes that side stream doesn't come back to the main river. So you can think about how much less consciousness, or if we're using the stream analogy, how much less water is available to the mainstream when that splitting off has happened. And this is what causes post-traumatic stress, because a portion of you gets frozen at the moment it occurs. This is what a flashback is really about. And when we're talking about emotional triggers, you're getting an emotional flashback. It's memory, but it's the emotional aspect of memory. So that flashback is basically being triggered, letting you know that there's an aspect of yourself that is stuck at that moment of trauma that has not been able to come forward and find resolution so as to join your adult self.
But in one way you said it was freeze, like something happened with me when I was 3 years old, so that part froze, but you also said that it kind of goes away, that the stream went away. I'm curious about that. Like, does it disappear, or, I mean, where does it go?
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a really good question. In the moment of trauma, you will find multiple fragments of self, which is part of what makes soul retrieval work so incredibly fun / difficult, because let's just use the concept of a little girl who is molested. Let's say a little girl's laying in bed and she's molested by her dad. In that moment of trauma, it can be so traumatizing that it's not just one split that happens within the self. It's many. So you'll see one split that gets frozen at the moment of trauma and literally is stuck there. You'll see another split that's maybe meeting its need by going into a fantasy reality where she's Pocahontas. You'll see another aspect trying to hide somewhere in the room. Very common for an aspect of soul to hide inside the perpetrator himself or herself.
Okay.
And so it's this fracturing that happens. And when we're doing this kind of retrieval work, we bring those fractured aspects of self back. And for somebody who's doing this work, it will be highly visual. It'll be like a visualization and a sensation. For someone like me, who's an extrasensory, I'm actually observing these aspects coming back. So as a person does this process, their emotional body will look as if it has these holes, right? Kind of like somebody took a cookie cutter and just cut these aspects out of the aura.
Right, in the aura, so you see like holes. Okay, yeah.
What was the most interesting thing for me when I was doing my out-of-body work years ago is when I started going into these holes within the aura, I in fact found out that they were like vortexes or wormholes.
Oh.
So instead of being like a genuine hole where you go through the hole and you're just on the other side of the person, if you go into them, you get sucked back into where that aspect of the soul stream is stuck.
Wow.
Yeah, super awesome. So long story short, before we go on with the process itself, I went into an existential crisis about whether to actually release this to the public.
Okay.
Because of the fact that dissociation, which is what causes this fracturing that ultimately causes the issue with trauma, happens when you can't emotionally deal with an experience. There is a very high likelihood that if somebody goes into that experience again, which is absolutely necessary for healing, that they can't deal with it again in adult life. And so I've essentially, by virtue of exposing this process to the world, put people in a crisis. And so there's a lot of therapists in the field that believe that trauma work, memory work, should never be done outside the context of therapy. But the reality is while some people in the world may be fortunate enough to live in countries where that is an option for people, it's not the case in my country and many other countries in the world, where therapy is quite literally a luxury. And when you're looking at low income, and when you're looking at, let's say, the demographics of people who absolutely need this kind of process the most, they are the people who have the least amount of finance to pay for it. So my crisis was, do I take a very powerful tool and put it in the hands of people regardless of the risk, because it's very important to me to have somebody be able to have that tool versus be told it's too powerful of a tool, I'm sorry, you don't have the money for it. Or whether I'm going to withhold that from the mainstream and distrust people and be like, sorry, it's too risky for me, don't want to defend my own process, don't want to risk people going through things that they can't handle because they have no support network. And it was something that I struggled with. It was something that I talked to several other spiritual teachers about. One of my closest friends in this life is Eckhart Tolle, and he ultimately ended up, let's say, pushing me over the edge by saying, I really feel like the world needs this. I feel like the world is ready, and I feel like you should do it. So
I just want to comment on that, because I think it's very important, because I can identify with that, oh, I wish, I had a therapist or a coach, like I need to deal with this stuff. But then I'm like, no, I can't spend money on that. I should spend money on other things. And then I'll just end up not working with it. And so people need tools. And that's why I love the internet and YouTube and free videos, so everybody can see this, because there can't be just one solution, like with the therapist in the therapist room. There's got to be other ways to deal with stuff in yourself. So I just want to say that. Very glad you did it.
Thank you. We'll see how it goes over in the future. I've been training facilitators, meaning training people to do what I do, which is to lead people through the process, just in case people feel like they really need that support. And also, setting up this huge base of people that I have with what we're calling Teal Tribe, which is this big base of, it's basically, it's like a social media version of an intentional community, and very large. Part of the reason I set that up is so that people could have support. But besides that, it's the only safety net that I've really put there for this process. So I'm about to put in people's hands the tool for resolving trauma, but it means revisiting the trauma you went through, which is not so fun, as I can testify.
So can we go through the process a little bit? Like, how do you know where to start? Like, you have all these issues. Where should I start? People, or I can only speak about myself. Sometimes I feel like, oh, there's so many things that I need to work with. What is the most important thing? How can I know what the core is,
Well, the good news is you don't even have to think about it.
Okay.
What I designed this process so you don't have to know anything about what you were traumatized by. Nothing at all. Because what this has been like in mainstream, shall we say, is that triggers, you understand the concept of triggers, or should I go into that?
Yes.
Okay. So an emotional trigger is an emotional flashback. And the way that we've been dealing with traumatized people over the last, let's say, centuries, is that we're trying to decrease triggers. So let's just go with somebody who's come back from war. It's pretty common, if there are fireworks going off, that somebody who is in a situation in war where they were in direct combat and got into a shootout situation, when you see those, let's say, entertainment pieces going off in the air, their brain is not telling them this is for entertainment. They're saying, okay, I'm back in hell. And then they may dive underneath tables, and like they're back there emotionally in that space of being traumatized. Standard practice is to try to decrease the trigger, meaning we try to get it so they don't feel that way. And what I'm about to say is that we should be doing the opposite. We're getting the flashbacks emotionally and mentally, because that is you trying to call your consciousness back to the event so you can find some resolution there. So you don't need to know anything about what you suffered from or about the priority. All you need to pay attention to is your triggers. And when you get a strong emotional trigger, that is your "it's time now" message for you to then engage with the process. And so instead of thinking about it in terms of you leading this process, meaning I'm going to lead it and I'm going to go back to this time, you kind of take a back seat to your body and say, I'm just going to let my being tell me what needs integration according to what is manifesting externally as this triggering situation.
Right. Okay. So then you get a trigger and you ask yourself, what is this about? And you let your subconsciousness, in a way, come up with a memory?
In a roundabout way, but there are several steps to it.
Okay.
There are 18 steps, I think. That's what we ended up with, 18 individual steps to this completion process. But the first thing you do is you sink into the trigger. So most people, in conjunction with what they've been taught by society, when they start feeling really crappy, they try to do something to feel better. What I lead people to do is the exact opposite. You develop an intense level of conscious presence with that negative trigger. And so people are sinking into it, sitting with it, really feeling it, letting themselves experience it. And you can think of that as intensifying the vibration. We're getting it very, very strong. So after a while, you're asking this sensation the question, when was the first time I felt this exact same way? And so instead of like mentally trying to figure it out, you let it come to the surface. So the emotional trigger is essentially acting like a rope that you're going to climb backwards through time with to the original thing that's popping up. So for example, if in the present moment I'm feeling like this intense implosion, maybe I ask that question and I suddenly have an image of me being in a crib. Now these memories are going to be more or less, let's say, put together. A lot of times with extreme trauma, there's fragmenting of the memory itself. That's how the brain stores trauma. It stores the images separate from the emotions, separate from the sounds, and so it'll feel kind of piecemeal to begin with. But you're basically, the process allows you to just work with whatever is coming up so that you can find integration and resolution with that memory. So at a certain point, after you've intentionally relived the experience, which is, by the way, the number one argument I'm going to be having over the next year, because there's a huge argument within the psychological community about the concept of re-traumatization through re-experiencing memory versus those of us in my camp, which is it's literally the only way to heal. Now, I can explain to people exactly why it's the only way to heal, but people will be re-experiencing what they went through. So, for example, if you were a 4-year-old getting raped, you're reliving your rape, but this time with the conscious intention to do it. You're saying, I'm willing this time, instead of dissociating, I'm willing this time to intentionally experience this and then to find resolution with it. So eventually that memory, once it's been re-experienced, becomes switched into an active visualization. So you're allowing your mind and your being to find a resolution within the context of the memory. So for example, the 4-year-old may be able to be defended. So at a certain point, you bring in the adult self, and the adult self, say, throws off the perpetrator and like does away with him, so that we're moving the child's self, or that stuck aspect of self, through the visualization of the child into a space of safety. And so we're essentially taking what's unresolved and we're creating the opposite experience. And this is self-referencing, is what we call this in the psychology community. It's basically like, if you're not feeling safe, let's create something that feels like safety so that I can have that experience. And by doing that on a spiritual level, you're actually creating the expansion for the person. So post-traumatic stress disorder, and everyone has it, by the way, to a certain degree. That's why you react the way you do. You know, that when we get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder is just when it interferes with our life to the degree that we can no longer function. But there's not a person on earth that does not have post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. So basically, post-traumatic stress disorder is all about, I couldn't find the expansion through this experience. And so it provides you that experience. This is what the expansion is. So you step into it, and then that fractured aspect of soul rejoins with the current self, and you can then move forward with it. what is frightening is watching how your current life alters as a result of it. Because what we have to understand is you can go back in time mentally and emotionally. The only thing you need an actual time machine for is to go back physically. So when
you're
you're
saying
doing
that you're actually going back in time in a way?
yes. Oh, that is exactly what I'm saying. And the major issue with that is if you go back in time and you alter the emotional and the mental causation, you are altering your life mentally and emotionally in the current moment.
Like,
And it is,
are you changing the timeline in a way as well?
well, time is, let's say, a dimension that is subject to a lot of physical laws.
Okay.
So what it is that you're altering the mental and the emotional, let's say, timeline for the sake of mental understanding. The emotional and mental timeline you are altering the causation of. And this is, it's both the most promising and the most frightening aspect of this process. Because, like, for example, I'll be working with somebody, this is a true story. I was working with somebody who's a chain smoker. I'm talking 12 packs a day. And we went back, basically, the trigger is when I want to smoke. So we were starting to work with that. Instead of smoking, I was taking her back to that feeling of emptiness and needing to take something in. And it was actually when her mother put her on a diet when she was very young. Took her to a doctor. Doctor said we need her to lose some weight. She's off the chart. And so they put her on a diet, and she had that feeling of starvation. So later in life, she learned to cover up that feeling of starvation, which was unresolved with the cigarettes. Anyway, we resolved the let's say, emotional component, that memory. We found resolution with it. The very next day, and there is no explanation for this on a scientific level, because what do we know? We know that your cells get addicted to nicotine, right? That's what the story we've been told forever. Next day, she has a smoke break. She doesn't go. Didn't even realize she didn't go until after it was already passed, and then was like, what the hell?
Huh.
I actually don't have a desire. Like, the craving doesn't even exist.
Wow.
Which is, more and more proof of the fact that a lot of the symptoms we're seeing in our adult life are in fact just a symptom of a causation which we can alter. So the scariest aspect of this is that when you do this kind of work, you come back a completely different person on an emotional and mental level. And I have seen people's lives literally overnight as a result of doing this process, like completely unravel and have to shift into something else because of it. So it's like if you resolve this thing back in your childhood that's leading you to this abusive relationship, the marriage is ending. It's that fast. You will come out of it, and it's like either you're okay with what's happening in the present moment, or you're not okay with it and it has to change. So it is like, hold on to your seats for everything to shift, ultimately in a better direction. But you know what it's like to be in that uncertainty where it's like everything's changing.
And you probably attract different things as well because you have changed your frequency and your energy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like overnight attracting different stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Exciting. Yeah. I thought about that. This reminds me a little bit about shamanic work. And I feel like sometimes, in spirituality, there's so many names and different schools and ways. And then I was like, but isn't this shamanism, or isn't this, where you are retrieving soul parts? Would you say that that's similar? Or?
Ultimately, I love this because like everybody wants to put things into a certain camp, but the reality is like if there's a universal truth out there, pretty much every different modality is going to trip upon it somehow, So what's happening is that these groups that would call themselves shamanic groups, by virtue of becoming more aware universally and the natural process of spiritual awakening, they've tripped on this concept that souls can fragment, that you can go back and retrieve them, that traveling through time is not limited to the physical dimension in a time machine. And so for years, a lot of different people and tribes around the world have been practicing shamanic soul retrieval. And each one seems to have a different variation for how they do it. Oftentimes with shamanic soul retrieval, it is somebody who is in the position where I am, somebody who's able to do interdimensional travel that is retrieving those aspects of self for a person. my real goal doing this was to try to create a way that people could do it for themselves. That was my ultimate goal. I don't want anybody to be dependent on a healer or anything to be able to retrieve these aspects of self.
Right.
So in creating the process the exact way that I did it, and I did it a very specific way for very specific reasons, I wanted to basically say, this is how you can do it in your own life with your triggers, regardless of whether anybody's there or not. So it's like putting a huge, like, magic wand, so to speak, in somebody else's hands.
But that's awesome, because I feel like before it was all about the gurus and the teacher up there, and we were like, okay, that's what I should do. And now it's the empowerment. We can do it ourselves. We don't need so many external things. We can do it. I love that. Mm-hmm. But so where where are we going with this? Like, what's the goal? Or I mean, you can't say goal, but if you is the goal to become like I'll just let you put that in.
Is the goal what?
Yeah, is the goal in a way to be whole, and what does it mean to become whole? I mean, I'm just wondering how I would feel if I was whole. Like, what would that be like?
For the sake of people's understanding, we have to put it that way, that the ultimate goal is to become whole and to become enlightened. But what you find when you progress in the direction of finding wholeness, or in the direction of finding enlightenment, is that the path of spirituality kind of folds you back in on yourself, and you realize that even the quest for those things sends yourself a message that you're not actually in a state of wholeness as you are. And so it becomes much more about what we call unconditional presence. It becomes about how am I whole as I am? How was I never fractured? You know, and like, this is the frustrating part for people to conceptualize of when it comes to spiritual progression, is because it'll turn you in loop-de-loops. There is no straight line when it comes to spiritual practice. What's true today is going to be invalidated tomorrow, and you got to have the flexibility to allow that to happen. But in answer to your question, the ultimate goal seems to be unconditionally present with yourself regardless of how you are. And by virtue of doing that, you are in a state of awakening. By virtue of doing that, you are not experiencing extreme negative emotions. And when you do experience emotions, which you will experience them as a flavor. You won't add any meaning to it. And so your experience of them will be quite different. So right now, for example, it's the experiencing of grief and what I'm telling myself that means for me in my life that's actually causing me the amount of suffering that I'm experiencing right now. But I can experience grief without having grief mean suffering. So that is what changes as you progress through this process.
So that you accept that the feeling is there. You're not, in a way, you can label it, but you're not resisting it or judging it. You're just aware that it's there and letting it be there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And one of the things I love so much about this process is inevitably it's going to lead all people to this one, let's say, fractured aspect of self. And it's the fractured aspect of self that originates from when we started to be socialized. The process of socialization teaches us that certain things are acceptable and certain things are not acceptable about us, especially emotions. So we'll find actually that we get a little bit stuck with the completion process at a certain point.
Okay.
And we start feeling like, I can't resolve it. I can't resolve it. I can't find resolution. And it's because you're running into an aspect of self, which is essentially a child self, that's sitting here with its arm folded saying, stop telling me that I have to be different than what I am right now. And like, as long as you are coming at me, wanting to heal me, like there's something freaking wrong about me, I'm not going to do anything for you. So it's that original trauma that we start to run into. And I love when people hit that point. It's like, most people are like, I feel like I'm failing with it. And that's my indication. It's like, hell yes. Because it means you run into that aspect of self where you are genuinely knocking on the door of self-acceptance.
Is that the healing track that you were talking about in the video recently?
Yeah.
In a way?